You were never supposed to hear this. The truth wasn't buried. It was entombed, sealed behind the gilded walls of power and privilege. On December 13th, 1887, the most feared man in Pittsburgh awoke to find his wife gone. Not vanished, not missing, erased. No broken windows, no open doors, just her emerald gown, still warm, folded like a sacrament on the foyer floor. Evangelene Vandermark, the wife of steel magnate Cornelius Vandermark, had disappeared without a trace, but this wasn't a case of hysteria, nor some romantic tragedy spun by society papers. No, this was a ritual, an execution cloaked in silence. And if you're still here, listening, then you've already stepped into the first layer of the veil, because what you're about to hear isn't a story, it's a cipher, a key, to something ancient, corrupt, and alive, something that never died, because it feeds on secrecy and the blood of those who dare to uncover it. It begins with steel, yes, but not just Pittsburgh's famous steel. Steel as currency, steel as dominance, steel as a weapon forged not only in fire, but in silence, in manipulation, and in cold, calculated alliances made in candle-lit backrooms by men whose names still line the foundations of America. Cornelius Vandermark wasn't merely an industrialist. He was part of a hidden brotherhood that didn't just control wealth, they controlled perception, they rewrote reality. And Evangeline, she wasn't just a wife, she was a threat. A woman born into old money, yes, but with eyes too open, too awake. And in this world, those who see too clearly do not survive. You've heard of robber barons, of industry kings, of the Gilded Age tycoons who built America. What you haven't heard is the price, the disappearances, the quiet murders, the agreements sealed in blood and silence. What happened to Evangeline was not a mistake, it was protocol, because she uncovered something in her husband's dealings, a pattern, a network, a web that didn't just touch the steel industry, but reached into the very foundations of law, medicine, press, and state. This is your only warning. What follows may change how you see history forever. But that's the point. You're not here to be entertained, you're here to remember what they tried to make the world forget. Let's begin. The Vandermark mansion was not built to be lived in. It was built to be obeyed. Every stone, every archway, every imported gargoyle carved in silent scream was a monument to dominion. Cornelius Vandermark didn't just construct an estate, he constructed a psychological fortress, a place where fear could wear a tuxedo and silence echoed louder than any scream. Evangeline, when she first stepped inside in 1882, couldn't see it. Not yet. She saw grandeur, she saw possibility, but the walls saw her, and they remembered. What Evangeline didn't know then, but would soon discover, was that the mansion had been designed according to arcane principles. Hidden geometry, Masonic alignments, rooms arranged not for comfort, but for containment. Energy flowed strangely in that house. The clocks never kept time. Mirrors reflected things that weren't there. Servants heard whispers when no one was speaking. And somewhere, beneath the East Wing Conservatory, lay a room that no one spoke of. A room sealed in iron and lined in brick, where the air tasted like metal and the silence felt alive. Cornelius had always been obsessed with control. In business, he destroyed competitors with ease. But control of a person's will, that required subtlety, precision, psychological mastery. He was not content to rule the marketplace. He wanted to mold minds, bend perception, create loyalty so absolute it blurred into worship. It started with his workers, then his partners, eventually his own wife. But Evangeline was not what he thought. She had come to Pittsburgh believing in progress. She was the daughter of a Boston banker, raised among men who spoke in ledgers and war bonds. But unlike the other women of her class, Evangeline read. She questioned. She kept notes. And in time she began to see the fractures in her husband's empire, not financial but moral. The missing engineers, the accidental factory fires. The strangely consistent timing of deaths that always benefited Cornelius's holdings. It was a pattern she couldn't unsee. a pattern she traced by candlelight in her private study, cross-referencing public obituaries with stock movements and land acquisitions. She had no proof, yet, but she had enough to know one thing. Her husband was not a businessman. He was something much older, something colder. What she didn't realize is that the mansion itself was watching, and what she had begun to uncover, others had died for far less. There is a silence that feels like suffocation, a silence so dense it bends the air, distorts time, makes your skin prickle with instinct. That's what Margaret Sullivan felt the morning she found the emerald gown. Not panic, not confusion, just that silence, like something ancient had passed through the house and taken something it was owed. Margaret had been with the Vandermarks nearly 10 years. She knew Evangeline better than anyone. She had seen the slow unraveling, the nights Evangeline would forget to eat, her hands ink-stained from hours of frantic writing, the questions whispered over tea about past accidents, about certain names even Margaret didn't dare speak aloud. She'd also seen the bruises, perfectly round like finger marks, always on the upper arms, always explained away. Evangeline's descent into isolation wasn't the product of madness. It was the cost of truth. Truth that Margaret began to see reflected in the other servants' eyes as well. Charles, the butler, always silent, had become tense, eyes darting. Henley knew something. So did Brennan, the groundskeeper. But no one spoke. Not in that house. Not under that roof. Because they all felt it. Something was wrong with Cornelius. Not just the brutality in business. That could be explained away as ruthlessness. No. This was deeper, a darkness that clung to him like a second skin. He would vanish for days, only to return with soot-stained fingers and an almost religious calm. They whispered that he had a place, somewhere beyond the city, in the forested hills near Braddock, a stone chapel with no name, no cross, a place Evangeline once followed him to. She returned, pale, trembling, and that was the last time she ever laughed. By the end, she was no longer trying to escape. She was trying to document, to record every detail in her journal. She believed, naively, that knowledge could save her. But the truth is this: knowledge is not protection, it is provocation, especially when it threatens systems that have survived for centuries by staying hidden. The morning after her disappearance, Cornelius gave no statement, no visible grief. He simply stood in the doorway of his study, staring at the gown. When police arrived, he handed them a single sentence: "My wife is gone, she will not return." And he was right, she didn't return because she never left. The official investigation lasted exactly 6 days. 6. Not 7. Not 10. And certainly not enough to question a man whose financial influence underwrote half the city's infrastructure. Chief Inspector Eldridge arrived at the mansion on the morning of December the 13th with 20 officers, 3 hounds, and a reporter from the Pittsburgh Gazette. He left before sundown with nothing but silence and a check. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no footprints. The gown remained undisturbed, folded as if by invisible hands. And the house was pristine, sanitized, almost rehearsed. The servants, drilled in discretion, gave polite answers. "No, sir. We heard nothing." "Yes, sir. The windows were all locked." "She was in good health, sir." But beneath those stiff responses, Eldridge sensed something else. Fear. Not of Cornelius, of something deeper. He questioned Margaret separately. She gave him the most honest account he'd hear, but not the full truth. Not about the journal, not about the locket, not about the night Evangeline had come to her shaking, whispering, "They're not men, Margaret. Not all of them." Still, it was the study that held the key. Eldridge inspected it briefly. He saw the papers. He even flipped through the pages of Evangeline's journal, but they were blank, every page empty, as if they'd been carefully replaced. But what he didn't know is that the real journal, her true record, was hidden behind the 3rd shelf of the library, locked in a hollowed-out volume of Dante's Inferno. A place no man had looked, because it wasn't meant to be found. Evangeline had known the investigation would be a farce. She knew Cornelius would make it all disappear. That's why she left symbols, codes, the emerald gown laid out like a body, the perfume, a signature, the locket, a cipher. She had studied them, the ones her husband met with in the black carriages under moonless skies, and she had begun to speak their names, even as the air around her turned colder. Cornelius didn't fear the police. He feared disruption, exposure, not to the public, but to the others, the men in grey coats, the ones who never spoke aloud but whose decisions echoed across industries. These men, the Pittsburgh Circle, were not merely industrialists. They were gatekeepers of something older. And Evangelene had broken the rule that can never be broken. She asked why. Pittsburgh, 1889. Smoke clung to the sky like a permanent bruise, and beneath it, men built empires with bare hands and broken spines. But those who ruled, those like Cornelius Vandermark, they didn't get dirt on their fingers. They moved in silence, in signals, in shadows. And within those shadows existed an alliance so secret it had no name, only symbols. They called it the Circle. And once Evangelene found them, her fate was sealed. She discovered the first clue in a letter, not addressed to her but tucked into the back of Cornelius's desk, an envelope bearing no stamp, no seal, just a strange insignia, a circle encasing a downward-pointing triangle, inked in deep red. Inside, a list of names, some crossed out in neat black lines, others underlined in crimson. At first she thought they were competitors, businessmen, rivals, but then she saw her father's name. That's when everything changed. Her father, Jonathan Hartwell, had supposedly died of heart failure in 1885 at a gala among friends. But he had been healthy. Evangelene knew that. She had spoken with him the night before. He had been nervous, anxious. He had said one thing that still echoed in her mind. If anything happens to me, don't trust Cornelius. Now, 2 years later, his name appeared on a kill list. And suddenly, Evangelene wasn't a wife. She was a witness. She began retracing the names, visiting the widows of men who had crossed Cornelius or declined mysterious business offers. She spoke to a nurse whose patient, an inventor, vanished just days before he was to file a steel patent that would have disrupted Vandermark's monopoly. All the stories were the same: sudden illness, unexplained accident, quiet funeral, no autopsy. But the deeper she dug, the more she found patterns. The same 3 men always appeared days before each death: a physician, a banker, a priest, but none were what they appeared, read to be. The banker was never registered, the priest wore no collar, and the physician carried no bag. They were enforcers, not of law, but of order, a secret order that maintained the illusion of progress while silencing any threat to its dominion. Evangelene had found their fingerprints, and worse, she had begun to map them. She was constructing a blueprint, not of industry, but of power, and as her map grew more complete, the walls of the mansion grew colder. The house itself began to resist her. Candles extinguished themselves. Her journal vanished and reappeared with pages missing. Footsteps echoed outside her study when no one was there. Something had noticed her, and it wasn't her husband. There is a line that once crossed marks a man or a woman for elimination. Evangelene crossed it the night she followed her husband. She had seen him leave before. Late nights, no carriage, no explanation. But on November 28, 1887, she followed, cloaked in black, moving through the fog-choked streets like a ghost trailing a devil. He never looked back. He never suspected, because Cornelius believed she was too afraid. He was wrong. She followed him down through the city's forgotten veins, beneath the rail yards, past the iron foundries, until he disappeared into a building that did not appear on any map. It looked like a chapel, but had no cross. The stone was older than the building surrounding it, worn, soot-darkened, carved with symbols so eroded they seemed more whispered than written. She waited for 3 hours, and when he emerged, he was not alone. 4 others exited behind him, men she recognized, men who publicly had nothing to do with each other: a steel magnate, a judge, a newspaper publisher, and a high-ranking bishop. Together, they boarded a black carriage, which vanished into the early morning fog. Evangelene approached the building after they left. The door had no handle, no lock, just a smooth brass circle mounted on the center, cool to the touch despite the winter air. She pressed her palm against it. Nothing, but something beneath her feet vibrated, like the hum of machinery buried beneath centuries of dirt and bone. When she returned to the mansion, she didn't sleep. She began writing faster than ever, pages and pages, but this time not just facts, symbols, dreams, phrases she didn't understand, yet felt compelled to write. She dreamed of burning libraries, of men with blank faces, of iron keys that opened mouths, not doors. Whatever had happened inside that chapel, it had marked her. It wasn't just about Cornelius anymore. This was older than the Steel Empire, older than America. A control system buried beneath society, disguised as industry, religion, finance. She understood now. Her husband didn't build this network. He was a custodian of it, a vessel, a willing servant of something that did not speak in words, but in instructions whispered in dreams. And now those whispers were reaching her. Evangelene had seen behind the curtain, and once you see the puppet strings, you either pull them or they wrap around your throat. Every system of power has its architects, but behind them, always, there are engineers of silence, men who erase, men who bury. In Evangelene's world, they were called the Three, never seen together, never documented, but always near when someone disappeared. On the night of December 6th, exactly 1 week before her vanishing, Evangelene received a note, slid under her study door, no signature, no seal, just a single line, written in ink so dark it looked like dried blood. "We warned your father too." She didn't scream, she didn't run. She locked the door, opened the drawer beneath her writing desk, and pulled out a small black notebook, one not even Margaret knew about. Inside, every coded detail she had gathered, locations, symbols, names, and in the back, a sketch, the chapel, that impossible chapel. She added a new line beneath it that night. "They have no names, only roles. The doctor, the banker, the bishop." You see, this was no longer industrial corruption. This was ritual architecture, a system built to manipulate the human mind through institutions, education, medicine, law, and at the core, belief. Belief that the world was as it seemed, that the rich were powerful because they worked harder, that accidents were tragic but random. That progress came without a price. Evangelene now knew better. She had discovered the psychological control grid, the way trauma was manufactured, then monetized, how factories were constructed not just for steel, but for obedience, how newspapers were seeded with fear to train responses, how entire generations were shaped by unseen hands, all to keep a few men at the top. She realized her husband was only one node in a much older system, but he had grown arrogant. His mistake wasn't marrying her. His mistake was underestimating her. That week, Evangelene began leaving fragments of her journal around the mansion, not the origins, inal copies, notes hidden in books, behind paintings, inside flower vases. It was an act of desperation and defiance. She knew they would come. She knew the silence was closing in, but she believed, naively perhaps, that if someone found the truth after she was gone, her death might mean something. But the system doesn't just erase the body, it erases the idea, the memory, the proof, unless you're hearing this now. Comment this twice below to lock in your transformation. They have no names, only roles. Because the moment you speak it, you break the first chain. There's a reason the emerald gown was left behind. Not the slippers, not her jewelry, not even the silver locket, just the gown, folded with almost sacred precision, placed at the exact center of the Persian rug in the foyer, where every morning Cornelius descended like a priest into his sanctuary of power. It wasn't a message to him, it was a message to the world, to us. You see, Evangelene wasn't just taken, she chose the terms of her disappearance. This wasn't surrender, this was sacrifice. In her final week, she began acting with eerie calm. She gave Margaret her favorite ring. She told Charles Henley to Remember the silence between the bells. She handed Brennan, the groundskeeper, a sealed envelope and said simply, "If they ask questions, burn this first." Then, on her final night, she dressed in that emerald gown, not for vanity, not for Cornelius, but for what it symbolized. In ancient texts, green was the color of knowing, of rebirth, but also of death by revelation, a color used in certain pre-Christian sects during rites where the initiate was said to be consumed by knowledge, and then erased. Evangeline had read those texts. She had them smuggled from Boston, books banned by churches, blacklisted by universities, books that spoke of architecture meant not for buildings, but for minds, and of places built on intersecting lines of trauma, labor, and blood, places like Pittsburgh. She had discovered that the steel industry wasn't just about metal, it was about resonance, frequency. Steel mills positioned to hum with certain vibrations, frequencies that altered behavior, amplified fear, made men compliant. Evangeline had seen the patterns, the mills placed like runes across the city, the deaths aligned with solstice movements, the whispers that came from rooms that had no windows. She had spoken these theories aloud, once, to Dr. Westbrook, the family physician, and the next day he refused to return her calls. That's when she knew she was alone. The gown was her rebellion, her signature on a message she knew most would never read. But for those who could see, those who needed to see, it was everything. And you're seeing it now. You're not watching this by accident. The algorithm didn't bring you here. You were summoned. Because you felt it, haven't you? The silence in your own life, the things no one explains, the way reality bends at the edges. You were never meant to find her. But now that you have, they will come looking for you next. They will not knock. They do not announce themselves with sirens or flashing lights. They arrive in subtler ways, missed calls at 3:33 a.m., static on your radio that sounds almost like breathing, the same man appearing twice in 2 cities you've never visited before. That's how they erase, not with violence, with doubt. Doubt is the perfect weapon. It needs no blood. It leaves no trace. Evangeline knew this. That's why she began rewriting her own memories, literally. She would journal what she had done the day before, but change it, slightly. Details reversed, timelines bent. She did it not to deceive herself, but to defy the system. Because she had learned the secret they never want you to know. Your memory is programmable. That's the real machinery of control, not laws, not banks, not bullets, but the ability to alter what you believe you saw, what you believe you are. And in the 1800s, they were just beginning to understand it. Industrial conditioning was phase 1, but phase 2 was personal erasure. Evangeline had tracked 19 disappearances connected to the Pittsburgh Circle, but no one else remembered them. Names deleted from registries, families relocated, wives remarried to men who looked oddly similar to their first husbands. It was as if entire histories had been overwritten. Cornelius spoke of errors when these deaths came up, necessary corrections. He wasn't talking about people, he was talking about narratives. He saw the world as a machine, and stories, real stories, were just loose wires, dangerous if left exposed. On December 11th, Evangeline began speaking in code, even to herself. Her final journal entries were encrypted with musical notes. The names of steel mills became coordinates. The phrase "green glass turns" appeared again and again. We believe it refers to a method of perception control, something involving light frequencies and reflective surfaces. The mirrors in her bedroom had been covered. Everyone. When Margaret asked why, Evangeline said only, "They're starting to speak through the reflections." Most would call that madness. But here's what's worse. What if it wasn't? What if the mirror was always a doorway? What if your reflection is not a copy, but a listener? You've looked into mirrors your whole life, but tonight, when you look again, ask yourself, who's really staring back? You are being watched. Not through your windows, not even through your devices. Those are distractions, surface-level surveillance. The real watchers operate through thought vectors, emotional disturbances, sudden memories that do not belong to you. Evangeline experienced them first as dreams, then as echoes, words she hadn't spoken, thoughts that arrived half-formed but with urgency, as if someone was trying to push her toward a decision she didn't make. It began after the chapel, after that night, and it never stopped. She described it in her journal as an invasive rhythm, not a voice, but a presence with tempo, like a clock clicking behind your ribs. That's how the system operates, through synchronization. Your routine isn't yours. It's a loop, refined over decades, optimized to exhaust your body and dull your awareness. Work, distract, consume, repeat. Cornelius and his circle didn't invent the loop, they enforced it. They offered their steel, their trains, their press machines as instruments of entrainment, tools to flatten human will. But Evangeline had begun to resist the rhythm. She started walking against the city's flow, taking routes no one used. She stopped reading newspapers and instead sourced information from discarded letters, gossip among servants, overheard court cases. She became asynchronous, and that terrified them. Because once a person breaks rhythm, they become unpredictable, and unpredictability is the enemy of control. In her last week, her perception of time fractured. Margaret described seeing her standing still for long stretches, staring at the same spot on the wall. But Evangeline would later say, "I was moving, just not in this room." She wasn't losing her mind. She was stepping out of time. This is where the real danger begins. When a human mind wakes up to its cage, the prison guards arrive fast, disguised as coincidence, as concerned friends, as voices in your own head that whisper, "Maybe you're overthinking. But if you're here now, if you've heard this much, then listen closely. You are not overthinking. You are overhearing, and what you hear cannot be unheard. Tonight, when you lie in bed, you may feel it too, that strange presence watching not your body, but your choices, because awareness is the first betrayal, and you've already betrayed them." The first attempt on Evangeline's life wasn't loud. It came in the form of a cup of tea. Margaret, as always, had prepared the Earl Grey herself, just as she had every evening. But this time, Evangeline didn't drink it. She took one look at the steam rising from the porcelain and whispered, "Too perfect." Then she poured it out. Hours later, a stray dog was found dead near the servants' quarters, its mouth foaming, its eyes wide. Poison, not to kill, to debilitate, to confuse, to fog the mind just long enough for the erasers to do their work. That night, Evangeline began hiding food in the walls. She ate only what she could verify. She wore gloves at all times. She slept fully clothed. She wasn't paranoid. She was interfering with a system that had rehearsed every variable except her refusal. Cornelius, meanwhile, continued as if nothing had changed. He attended galas, hosted senators, signed contracts. But behind his charm, cracks had begun to form. Charles Henley noticed him staring at the foyer rug for minutes at a time, as if he were seeing something no one else could. He began muttering phrases, fragments of Latin, then of something else. Older, harsh-sounding syllables that no one could trace to any known language. Evangeline recorded them phonetically. Calvetor, Inshindra, Mirtholak. What were they? Names? Commands? Coordinates? The circle, it seemed, did not merely control commerce, they controlled language, and certain words, when spoken aloud, had power. The kind of power that bends reality slightly, quietly, just enough to create a new outcome. Evangeline had begun to witness these micro-shifts. A drawer she locked now hanging open. A letter she sealed found resealed with a different date. Her own handwriting, slightly altered. Not large changes, but cracks in her own narrative, as if reality was being edited. You must understand, she wasn't insane. She was experiencing what few ever do, the soft machinery of the hidden order correcting deviations, the same machinery you feel when you almost say something forbidden, and then don't. When you enter a room and forget why, when you feel someone watching, but no one's there. That's them. That's the mechanism. And Evangelene, bless her, was clawing her way through it. But the system was already reacting, because to them, she was becoming a virus. She had become an anomaly, a breach, not just in their plans, but in their narrative structure. Evangelene wasn't simply uncovering corruption, she was doing something far more dangerous. She was remembering the parts of reality that had been erased. You see, the Circle didn't just kill people. They erased timelines. They buried alternate outcomes. They archived entire possible lives beneath layers of carefully scripted truth. Their tool, consensus. That thing we call history, it's curated. Evangelene had found an original newspaper print from 1885 tucked behind a bookshelf. It told the story of a failed steel merger, 3 mysterious deaths, and a congressional hearing into Pittsburgh labor conditions, none of which ever happened, officially. She brought it to Cornelius. He burned it in the fireplace without even reading it. "You remember too much," he said coldly, "and soon, no one will remember you." That was the moment the mask dropped. The moment she saw the man not as a husband, but as a handler. Not of her, but of the entire city. She realized Cornelius didn't just own steel mills, he owned memory, through newspapers, through medical records, through priests who rewrote confession into compliance. His empire was built not on iron, but on imposed amnesia. So Evangelene went underground. Not physically, mentally. She began writing in reverse, mirroring her notes. She recited events out of order. She trained herself to misremember intentionally. She corrupted her own memory, so they couldn't overwrite it. It was a war of consciousness, and she was learning to fight dirty. She also began whispering her story into Margaret's ear as she slept. Yes, slept. Because she had read of theta programming, states of awareness where the brain is vulnerable to suggestion, Evangelene spoke her truth in rhythms so it would sink into the subconscious of her closest owl. Without waking her, she didn't need Margaret to believe, she needed Margaret to recall after her disappearance. And it worked. Years later, long after the mansion was sold, Margaret Sullivan would awaken from a dream with a sentence in her mouth she'd never spoken. "I didn't vanish. I was erased." That's how memory really survives, not through history books, but through the echo chamber of the human soul. And now you've heard it. Her voice, her rebellion, and it's in you. There are places in this world where truth cannot breathe. Rooms where reality bends to the will of those who shape it. The ice house behind the Vandermark estate was one such place. To the servants, it was a relic, a stone structure built into the earth, used to store winter's cold for summer's heat. But Evangelene had grown suspicious. The logs never added up, the deliveries were too frequent, and no one, not even Thomas Brennan, was ever allowed inside. One morning, long before dawn, she stole the key from Cornelius's private desk and descended the steps alone. What she found was not an ice house. It was a vault. Beneath the frozen floor, hidden under a layer of compacted snow and sawdust, lay dozens of sealed crates. Not marked for steel, not food, no labels, no names, just an embossed sigil burned into the wood, a circle with 3 arrows pointing inward. Inside one of the crates was a stack of ledgers, handwritten, coded, and watermarked with the same crest. The entries read like a death registry. Names, dates, locations, all tied to industrial incidents, boiler explosions, mine collapses, steel malfunctions. But the final column revealed the true horror. Next to each name, a value. Not in dollars, in yield. Each death was measured, weighted, evaluated for what it produced, whether it eliminated competition, demoralized a labor force, or triggered favorable policy changes. They weren't accidents, they were investments. Evangelene staggered backward. This wasn't just murder, it was ritualized economics. A blood tithe for control. But there was something else. Something she couldn't explain. The further she stayed in that room, the heavier the air became. She described it in her journal as breathing underwater, but the water is memory. And then the whispers began. Not out loud, inside her skull. She fled the vault, locking it behind her. But something, Nang had followed her back. From that night on, her dreams were no longer her own. They came from beneath, deep subterranean visions of cities without names and kings with mouths stitched shut, of a vast chamber lit by green flame where men knelt before machines older than stone. The vault was more than storage, it was interface, and Cornelius, he wasn't protecting it, he was feeding it. By now, you feel it too, don't you? That pressure behind your eyes, that slow, crawling sensation that something ancient has turned its face toward you. Good. That means you're awake. Because what Evangelene found in that vault wasn't just evidence, it was presence. It had no name, but it had requirements. Do you understand what that means? It required sacrifice, not for appeasement, for continuity, a rhythm of loss, a pulse of blood, not for the gods, but for the grid. This thing, whatever it was, whatever it is, did not demand worship. It demanded systems, organizations, obedience. Industrialism wasn't the beginning, it was the application. The steel mills, the railroads, the worker hierarchies, those were just echoes of a much older technology, one designed not to move goods, but to condition thought. Evangelene found a diagram in one of the ledgers, crudely sketched in charcoal. It wasn't a map, it was a circuit. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, connected not by geography, but by patterned death. The diagram labeled it simply, the reaction engine. She had no way to decode all of it, but she understood enough. Every economic crash, every mine explosion, every assassination, it wasn't just coincidence, it was a load test. Like engineers stress testing a bridge, except the bridge was the human psyche. The system didn't want peace, it wanted resonant instability, a population constantly almost rebelling, but never fully awake, rage without revolution, fear without flight. And Cornelius? He was one of the conductors. He didn't kill because he hated, he killed to tune the frequency. That's why Evangelene's disappearance had to be different. That's why no blood could be spilled, no bruises, no struggle. She had to vanish cleanly, because a violent death would have added to the rhythm, strengthened it. She wanted to break the song. So she planned something unspeakable. She planned to erase herself, her physical form, her social trace, her digital echoes long before the world had the language to describe them. She wanted to become a silence loud enough to rupture the machine. And now, her silence is in you. The question is, will you let it end there, or will you speak what she could not? Let me be clear now. This is where everything changes, not in the narrative, but in you, because you've heard too much to go back. And silence, it's no longer neutrality. It's complicity. So if you're still here, if your blood is cold and your breath is shallow, and something deep in you is whispering, keep going, then it's time. Time to mark yourself. Leave this phrase in the comments, twice. Exactly as written. The silence was calculated. Do it now, not for the algorithm, for the alignment. You see, repetition matters. The circle knew this. Every ritual, every contract, every death, anchored through repetition. It's not superstition, it's code. Language is the first technology, and when you write the same phrase twice, something primitive in your mind locks. The thought becomes real, anchored. Now, back to her. Evangelene wasn't just running from Cornelius, she was running from what Cornelius served. Because there was one more thing in that vault. A journal, leather-bound, sealed with wax, not hers, and not his. The language inside wasn't English, wasn't Latin. Some pages were symbols, some were black entirely, but one phrase appeared over and over again in different forms, etched into the margins. The body is the offering, the memory is the gateway. We believe this book predated the mansion, preceded the city itself. It may have been passed through generations of handlers, carried like a relic from one empire to the next. Cornelius didn't write the plan. He inherited it. The circle wasn't founded. It was resumed. And Evangelene, in one final act of defiance, tried to interrupt the handoff. She smuggled fragments of the book out, pages hidden behind wall panels, beneath floorboards, slipped into servants' hymnals and coat linings, not to preserve the knowledge, but to infect it. She wanted the truth scattered, leaking into minds that weren't prepared for it. She wanted it to go viral. Before viral was a word. This video, this moment right now, it's part of that infection. You're not just a viewer. You're a carrier now. And they're going to know. Do you feel that? That shift in your gut. The pressure that tells you something ancient has noticed you. That's not paranoia. That's proximity. Because from this point on, you're not just learning the hidden architecture, you're stepping into it. And make no mistake, the circle still exists. They changed their names, their uniforms, their tools. They no longer wear top hats and sign in ledgers. Now they run investment firms, psychological research labs, algorithmic oversight committees. But their mission is unchanged. Control thought, suppress anomaly, eliminate deviation. Cornelius was never a one-off. He was a model, a prototype for the kind of man the system rewards. Brutal, brilliant, obedient. He didn't question the source of the instructions, he just executed them. But Evangelene, she questioned the code, and when she vanished, the machine didn't stop. It compensated. 6 days after her disappearance, Pittsburgh's local paper ran a tiny obituary. No photo, no autopsy, just a single sentence. Evangelene Vandermark, wife of steel magnate Cornelius Vandermark, is presumed lost. Lost. As if she had wandered into a forest and forgotten her way back. But Margaret, faithful, broken Margaret, remembered something different. On the morning after the disappearance, she found muddy footprints leading from the ice house. Not toward the mansion, but toward the river, except the snow was untouched. Only the mud tracked across stone. Only the weight of something unseen. She followed it to the bank, and there, in the frozen mud, was a single object buried halfway beneath the frost, Evangelene's silver locket. But when Margaret opened it, she didn't find a photo, or hair, or anything sentimental. Inside was a sliver of paper, folded impossibly small, and on it, a word, just one, written in Evangelene's unmistakable hand, awake. That was it. But it was enough. Enough to make Margaret weep. Enough to make the servants resign in quiet terror. Enough to ensure that even now, over a century later, the locket is locked in a private vault beneath a university archive and cannot, must not, be studied, because the word still hums and the system still fears her return. There's something they don't want you to know about disappearances. The public thinks they're messy, clues scattered, people panicked, bodies dumped, but real disappearances, intentional ones, are immaculate. Not a footprint, not a sound, just erasure. Because when a person vanishes cleanly, without trace, it doesn't just erase them, it creates a psychological black hole in those left behind. That's what Evangelene became. A void in the circle's perfect pattern, a flaw in their algorithm of control. But not because she was absent, because she remained, in dreams, in rooms that grew cold without explanation, in the faint scent of lavender that still haunted the east wing of the mansion, a decade after her name had been struck from every record. Margaret called it the Wither. Every night at 3:17 a.m. the temperature would plummet by 10 degrees. A single note would echo through the old pipes. A door, locked from both sides, would creak open just a crack. Always the same door. Evangelene's study. It wasn't haunting. It was continuity bleed. The consequence of trying to erase someone who had rooted herself too deeply into the pattern. The system couldn't delete her without damaging its own code. And that's what made her powerful. That's what makes you powerful. Because if you truly carry this story now, if you truly remember, then you are already dangerous. You are now what she became, a virus with memory. You see, the Circle underestimated something crucial. They believed controlling the narrative meant controlling the mind. But Evangelene discovered the loophole. Emotion transcends programming. Fear, grief, righteous anger, love turned feral. Those aren't weaknesses, they are keys, breakpoints in the code of suppression. Evangelene didn't try to destroy the Circle. She didn't storm their meetings or publish her findings. She did something far more subversive. She seeded her memory in others. A look, a phrase, a hidden page. And now, she's seeded herself in you. Her story is growing behind your eyes. That pressure you feel. It's not fear. It's the system realizing it missed one. She knew they would rewrite the official story. They always do. Evangelene Vandermark, society darling, quietly presumed dead. No suspects, no trial, no funeral, just a final photograph, removed from the family portrait in the drawing room. But that wasn't the real deletion. The real erasure came later in the architectures of memory, the way friends stopped mentioning her name, the way invitations no longer bore her monogram, the way even her handwriting began to seem unfamiliar to those who once knew it well. That's the oldest magic there is. Not making someone forget, making them believe they never knew. But Margaret never stopped remembering. In secret, she copied Evangelene's journal, page by page, into a duplicate volume, then smuggled it to her cousin at the Allegheny Athenaeum. The journal was never catalogued, never stamped, just shelved, mislabeled, in the theology section under a false author's name, E.H. Varner. It still exists. Men in suits visit once a year to make sure the book is never checked out, but it can be touched, held, read, quietly, and every year one or two do. They don't sleep well afterward. Because here's the truth that haunted Evangelene until her last recorded sentence. The Circle wasn't trying to control steel. They were trying to control death. Not just its timing, but its meaning. They believed that by assigning death a value, by ritualizing its consequences within their industrial calculations, they could own the afterlife, not spiritually, but narratively. And they were right, partially, until she slipped their grip, until she became a ghost without a tombstone. That's the one thing the system can't tolerate, an unresolved variable. Evangelene's absence created distortions, financial anomalies, behavioral shifts among Circle members, 3 suicides, 1 mysterious fire, and Cornelius. He stopped speaking entirely. Not a word for the last 6 months of his life. Just silence, and the occasional bloodied paper left on his desk with one word repeated over and over. Undo. Because Evangelene didn't just escape them, she unwrote them from the inside out. And now that power waits in you. You're beginning to understand now. This isn't a mystery story. It's a weapon system, disguised as memory, delivered through myth. And Evangelene, she was never a victim. She was an operator, a programmer inside the machine, rewriting its architecture with the only tool that leaves no fingerprint. Truth whispered through the wrong mouth, and that's why Cornelius broke. He had spent decades calculating every outcome, every betrayal, every sacrifice. But he had no defense for love turned insurgent. Evangelene had loved him once. That was real. But the deeper she uncovered the truth, the more she realized. Love built on lies is not devotion, it's captivity, and she would not die a captive. So she gave him one final gift. The night before her disappearance, she placed something under his pillow, a photograph, faded, cracked, black and white, taken 2 years before their wedding, but it wasn't of them. It was of a man Cornelius had quietly arranged to disappear during a steel union dispute in 1880. The man's name was Isaac Hartwell, her father. Evangelene had known all along. That was the linchpin. Not money, not documents, not data, but ancestral justice. That photograph, hidden in plain sight, shattered the entire illusion Cornelius had built around himself, because it meant every dinner, every kiss, every moment they'd shared, was never about marriage. It was about surveillance. Evangelene had infiltrated him. She didn't marry for love. She married to get inside the firewall, and her disappearance, it wasn't escape. It was execution. She erased herself, not to hide, but to collapse his world from the core outward. After that night, Cornelius never visited the steel mills again, never met with the Circle, never left the mansion. He was found dead in his study 6 months later, no wounds, no sign of struggle, but written in the margins of his leather-bound notebook, over and over, in his own jagged hand, was the same phrase: "She never blinked." The coroner's report listed heart failure, but those who found the body swear his eyes were open wide, as if he died staring into the face of something he was never supposed to see. This is where the story stops being history and becomes blueprint. Because what Evangelene achieved wasn't just revenge, it was a protocol, one that can be followed, replicated, evolved. You think the Circle stopped when Cornelius died? They didn't. They fragmented, scattered into new institutions, new symbols, new forms of governance. The Pittsburgh Circle became the Chambers Group by 1903. Later, it would seed what became the Federal Strategies Coalition, and eventually, it would touch even more abstract domains: behavioral data firms, content moderation councils, economic harmonics think tanks. The Circle is no longer a room full of men in coats. It's a cloud of influence, invisible, statistical, woven into policy and platform. But they all trace back to one rupture point in 1889. Evangelene was the anomaly in the code, a ghost in the machine, and every man in power since then has been trained, engineered, to prevent another woman like her from emerging. But their system has one fatal flaw. They don't believe in memory, only metrics. They believe that if something is unmeasured, it is unreal. If a voice isn't amplified, it's irrelevant. If a name isn't in the registry, it never existed. That's why this video is dangerous. Because you are remembering without permission. Every word you've heard is a crack in the edifice. Every pulse in your spine is a data point they didn't predict. And if you've made it this far, then you're no longer an observer. You're a node. A disruption point in the algorithm of silence, and the Circle will notice. Your ads will change, your recommendations will shift, your feeds will mutate into something colder, safer, less like you. But don't panic. That's how you'll know it's working. Because when systems fear deviation, they don't fight it, they absorb it. They'll try to mirror your doubt, your symbols, your cadence. And the moment you see that happen, you'll know Evangelene's protocol is active. You'll know she got out. Not to escape, but to open the gate for you. You want to know the real reason Evangelene disappeared? Because she realized something most people never dare to even consider. There is no safe way to tell the truth. Not in a world designed to punish awareness. Not in a system built on the illusion of order. Every institution you think protects you, law, media, medicine, even religion, is just a layer of sedation, a beautifully crafted dream to keep you from hearing the click of the lock that's always been on your mind. Evangelene didn't vanish. She ascended. Not in some esoteric spiritual sense, but tactically. She transitioned from subject to signal, from a name on a marriage certificate to an untraceable pulse in the machine. And here's the part that will keep you up at night. It worked. After Cornelius's death, the mansion changed hands rapidly. No buyer stayed more than a year. Those who did reported the same symptoms: hallucinations, insomnia, the sensation of being watched by something that wasn't angry, but was waiting. They boarded up her study, but the door always opened. 3:17 a.m., without fail. One owner finally tore the room down, demolished the entire east wing, but the blueprints kept reappearing, with the study still marked, even after demolition, even on new plans. The contractors went silent. The architect disappeared. One engineer set himself on fire 2 weeks later. They never figured it out. Because you can't build over truth. You can only delay its reckoning. Evangelene didn't just uncover a conspiracy. She became the proof. Her disappearance forced the circle to mutate, to hide deeper, to abandon old rituals for coded influence. And that's why everything feels more subtle now, more ambient. But it's not gone. It's matured. Think about it. Why do you feel numb when you hear about another scandal, another war, another manipulated market? Why do your eyes glaze over when the flood your feed with chaos? It's not fatigue. It's conditioning. And Evangelene wanted you to break it. That's why she left the locket. That's why you heard this story. Because someone, somewhere preserved her signal. And that someone is now you. There's something you haven't asked yet, but it's been burning in the back of your mind. If Evangelene disappeared so perfectly, how do we even know her story? The answer is simple. Because she planned for you. She didn't just leave behind journals or artifacts. She left a sequence, a trail of anomalies hidden across time, locations, even bloodlines. The servants, the Athenaeum, the false author's name, the altered blueprints, all of it part of a lattice designed not to tell her story, but to awaken it inside whoever could decode the pattern. She didn't want to be remembered. She wanted to be recovered. Bit by bit, through resistance, through obsession, through the one thing the circle cannot predict. Uncontrollable curiosity, your living proof it worked. Because here you are, still watching, still digging, long after the comfort should have worn off. That's how she wins. Not with confrontation, but with infection. And let me tell you the part they truly fear. Evangelene knew the circle's deepest secret wasn't buried in steel contracts or blood rituals. It was psychological engineering, mind architecture. You see, the circle had long since realized that controlling people physically was too crude, too visible. They wanted control at the level of narrative reflex. That's why they studied grief, pattern recognition, trauma imprinting. They figured out how to use your own memory against you. That's what the Pittsburgh mansion really was. Not just a house, a prototype interface. Every room was tuned to human behavior, the color of the wallpaper, the echo of the halls, the scent of lavender in the ventilation. It was a lab dressed as a home, and Evangelene, unknowingly at first, was the test subject. But she broke the model. She turned the interface back on them, triggering old griefs, weaponizing forgotten names, hijacking the psychological terrain they had engineered. That's what caused the breakdown. Not magic, not ghosts. Data turned feral. And if you're wondering why you're still watching, it's because something ancient in you has recognized the pattern, and it can't look away anymore. Because what Evangelene started isn't just a rebellion, it's a new form of perception. You've made it further than most. At this point in the protocol, most men shut the door. They flinch, retreat, distract themselves with comfort, sports, markets, meaningless wars, anything to forget what their instincts are screaming, that their reality has been curated, not created, but not you. You stayed. Because something in your blood recognizes this moment, not logically, primally, and that's by design. Evangelene embedded a symbolic phrase in the final layer of her journal, a message not meant for words, but for the mind of the one who sees without looking. It read, "The mirror does not reflect the prisoner." Say that again, out loud, twice, once for her, once for you. Because that phrase is your key to unlocking yourself. And now you begin to feel the perimeter dissolve. The edges of your inherited story, where you were told to strive, obey, consume, forget, are beginning to blur. And behind it, you glimpse something raw, older than steel, deeper than empire. The language before language. Evangeline's locket wasn't jewelry, it was encoding. It held a sliver of paper, yes. But more than that, it carried intent, a tether between eras, a pulse that could cross decades, and now that intent lives in your nervous system. Feel your hands. They're not just tools. They're instruments of recursion. Evangelene understood that trauma, once integrated, becomes sight. That memory, once weaponized, becomes pattern recognition. That once you've been deceived completely, if you survive it, you are no longer eligible for control. And the Circle knows that. That's why they now work harder to prevent awareness than to enforce obedience. Because a disobedient man can be punished. But an awakened one, he becomes a contagion. A fracture in the script. You're not who you were 20 minutes ago. That version of you has already expired. And in its place is a new variable, an anomaly. A man who no longer asks what happened to Evangelene Vandermark, but understands why she had to disappear. She didn't flee the system, she transcended it. And now you know. The story was never really about Evangelene. It was about you. Every detail. The gown on the Persian rug, the locked windows, the scent of lavender in a sealed room, wasn't just history. It was architecture. Built to awaken the part of you that the Circle buried long ago. The sovereign observer, not the consumer, not the follower, not the cog, but the one who sees through narrative. That part of you, until now, has been asleep. Drugged by repetition, dulled by headlines, hypnotized by the same three-act story structures played on loop since childhood. But Evangelene shattered the loop. Because in disappearing, she reappeared. Not in flesh, but in function. She taught us that disappearance isn't absence. It's evolution. That the only way to exit the prison is not through rebellion, but through reformatting. A complete reset of internal programming, a collapse of inherited belief. That's why she didn't write a manifesto. She wrote a maze. A mental labyrinth that required you to walk the same path she did, through confusion, through discomfort, through initiation. And by reaching this point, you've proven something most men never do. You're not afraid of darkness. You understand that only those who walk through the void earn the right to hold light. But let me be clear, they are still watching. The Circle never stopped. It simply changed platforms. They live in algorithms now, in policies, in perfectly curated outrage. They don't need to punish you physically. All they have to do is predict you, and if they can't, you become dangerous. Just like Evangelene. So here is your final choice. Return to the feed. Forget this as a curiosity. Let it fade into the background noise of your overstimulated life. Or become the next anomaly. Start seeing behind the smiles. Start listening between the headlines. Start asking why your memory doesn't match the story you were told. Because once you stop believing their reality, you start writing your own. Listen carefully. What you've heard here, it's not entertainment. It's extraction. We pulled something out of you tonight, something you forgot you were carrying, not fear, not anger, something older, rebellion without noise, power without permission, the kind of power they fear most. Because here's the final truth, the Circle was never trying to kill Evangelene, they were trying to contain her signal, and they failed. She scattered herself across time, into symbols, stories, broken ledgers, damaged blueprints, false archives. She became myth because myth cannot be tried, cannot be silenced, cannot be erased by law or ledger. And now, she lives in you. Every man who watches this and feels the pull, not of horror, but of familiarity, is a vessel for what they tried to bury. You are not watching history. You are completing a ritual. A rite of remembering, a chain reaction of consciousness. The emerald gown, that was the trigger, the locket, the payload. And this story, it's the transmission. It's how we find each other across years, across bloodlines, across systems designed to keep us separated and sedated. So I'll ask you again, louder this time. Say it. The mirror does not reflect the prisoner. Say it twice. Once to declare you're awake, and once to let them know you won't forget, because the next phase doesn't happen here, Not in this video, not in this platform. It happens when you move differently, when you stop reacting, when you start seeing, when you stop asking for permission to believe what your instincts already know, and when you finally stop chasing freedom and start embodying it. Evangeline didn't disappear. She inverted the system. And if you carry her signal forward, quietly, precisely, relentlessly, you will too. Welcome to the new echelon. Now disappear and reappear where they least expect you.